The last child through the door that afternoon came in sideways, backpack half off one shoulder, sneakers squeaking on the tile floor, the way sneakers always do when children have been running somewhere they were told not to run. He was 9 years old, and his name was Marcus Jr., named for the volunteer who had helped build the app, and he dropped his backpack into a chair with the particular violence of a child who considered furniture his enemy. Cornelius Hayward watched him from across the room without turning his head the way a man watches something when he has already decided what it is and simply wants confirmation. The afternoon came in with the children. It came through the tall windows of Mount Zion Baptist Church, pressing long rectangles of amber light against the old floor, warming the smell of whatever was in the church kitchen. Black-eyed peas and something sweet cornbread, maybe the smell of a building that had fed children for years and intended to keep doing so. The program room held 12 tables, 4 chairs each, and within 20 minutes of 3 o'clock, it held 43 children working on homework or pretending to trading snacks, talking over each other in 3 simultaneous conversations that somehow never fully collided. Cornelius moved through it the way he moved through everything. Not slowly and not fast, but with the deliberate economy of a man who had spent decades in environments where unnecessary motion was a liability. He was 64 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way that has nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with decades of sustained physical necessity. His silver hair cut close to his head, his face carrying the kind of lines that are not simply age but the specific weight of work that mattered. His dark eyes moved constantly without appearing to. A volunteer named Deja was shelving donated books near the window when she paused and looked at the framed photograph on the office wall, a younger version of Cornelius. Broader hair not yet gray, standing in a photograph with 3 other men in front of a federal seal. He was wearing a jacket. The jacket said, U.S. Marshal, across the back in letters she could read from the doorway. She said, Neil, is that you? Cornelius glanced at the photograph as though seeing it from a great distance. He said another life. He kept walking. Deja looked at the photograph a moment longer. The younger man in the jacket was not a different person. He was the same person with fewer years in him. She understood that there were things about people that explained everything and that those people would tell you only once in passing, if at all. The Safe Harbor after-school program had been running for 11 years. It served more than 80 children between the ages of 6 and 14 children, whose parents worked evening shifts at the hospital, at the distribution center, at the 2 hotels on the highway outside town. The children arrived at 3 in the afternoon and could stay until 8. There was homework, help. There was dinner at 6. There was structured time and unstructured time, and the whole operation ran on a combination of church funding, 3 grants, and the unyielding organizational discipline of one man who had spent 22 years ensuring that things which needed to happen happened. Cornelius had built the program the same way he had built everything in his life that mattered, piece by piece, without announcing it, without asking whether it was possible. He had retired from the Marshal's service at 53, with a clean record, a commendation from the federal director, and the particular purposelessness that ambushes men who have spent their entire adult life inside a structure and then find themselves suddenly outside it. He had joined Mount Zion because the pastor was an old friend, and within 2 years he had converted a storage room into a program room, and the storage room's contents into something the parents of evening shift workers would drive 40 minutes to access. He did not talk about this. He did not require anyone to know about it. The program ran. That was the sufficient fact. The walk protocol had been Cornelius's idea. Between 5 and 6 in the evening, small groups of children could take a supervised 15-minute walk to the corner store 1 block over, a chance to move to breathe outside air, to have the particular dignity of a minor errand. He escorted the walks himself when his 2 youth volunteers were occupied with other children. He had done it more than 200 times. He had never lost a child. At 3:15, his phone rang. He answered it without looking at the screen because he had already learned whose call it would be. Dr. Simone Okafor said she arrived. He said she's at the third table. She came in with Marcus Jr. They argued about the window seat for approximately 4 seconds, and she won. There was a pause on the line that contained something warm. Simone said, "Thank you, Neil." She said it quickly, the way someone says it when they mean it deeply but have a surgery in 20 minutes and cannot let themselves feel deeply for more than a moment. He said, "She'll be here when you get here." She hung up. Cornelius put the phone back in his breast pocket. Amara Okafor was 7 years old, slight, with her mother's careful eyes and her own particular habit of arriving in a room and immediately locating the most responsible adult in it. She had been in the program for 6 months since her mother had taken the attending position at Caldwell Regional Hospital. And in those 6 months, she had developed a routine that she did not vary. She came through the door, she found Cornelius in the room, she sat down. Not always near him, not always talking to him, but in his sight line or he in hers, and the equilibrium seemed to satisfy something she did not have words for and did not need. Cornelius understood this in the specific way that men who have spent decades reading environments understand it not analytically, not as a problem to be solved, but as information to be honored. He had watched children attached to adults who were steady before. He had watched what happened to those children when the steady person left without warning. He had been that steady person for witnesses in federal protection, for colleagues in the field, and now for more than 80 children on weekday afternoons. And the mechanism was the same in every case you show up. You are the same. You do not deviate. He was aware of this. He had been aware of it since the 3rd week. He had not commented on it and had not changed his pattern because of it, and had made absolutely certain that she was included in every group activity and walked home every afternoon by whoever was on escort duty. He had simply kept her in his peripheral vision the way he kept everyone in his peripheral vision, which was total and constant and invisible. At 4:45, Marcus, the tech volunteer, not Marcus Jr., brought his phone to show Cornelius the check-in log. A green circle next to Amara's name. 3:07 p.m. Church address. The app logged a GPS timestamp at sign-in and sent an automatic notification to the guardian on file. Cornelius looked at the screen. He looked across the room at Amara. He nodded. The outdoor security camera had been adjusted the week before. A volunteer mentioned it wider angle now, covering the full 2-block stretch of the walking road after a break-in 3 years prior had left the church's east entrance exposed. Cornelius had been the one to insist on the camera when the break-in happened. He had selected the placement himself, standing outside in the cold, measuring angles with the precision of a man who understood exactly what coverage meant and why gaps in it were not acceptable. A patrol car had been circling the block more than usual that week. One of the younger volunteers mentioned it in passing the way people mention things. They want someone older and calmer to contextualize for them. Cornelius turned his head and looked at the window for exactly the length of time it took him to decide there was nothing actionable in the information yet. Then he turned back. He said nothing. At 5:22, he sent the message to the walk group WhatsApp. 5 parents on the list. Walk group departing now. Back by 5:40. His message was read by 4 parents within 2 minutes. The 5th read receipt appeared at 5:24. He knew Simone was between surgeries. He pictured her glancing at her phone in a scrubbed sink anteroom and feeling the particular relief of a parent who has entrusted her child to someone and received confirmation that the trust was warranted. 5 children left the church at 5:22. Cornelius counted them at the door, counted them at the sidewalk, counted them at the first cross street. 5. The walk to the corner store took 8 minutes. The children bought small things, chips, juice. One boy bought a postcard because he had started collecting postcards, and no one had told him this was unusual. Cornelius stood near the door and scanned the block with the unhurried comprehensiveness of a man who has trained himself never to see only what he is looking for. At 5:36, they began the walk back. At the crosswalk at the corner of Maple and 9th, The light changed before all 5 had crossed. 4 made it across. The 5th, Amara paused at the edge of the curb, the way children pause when they are deciding whether to run. And in that moment a truck passed wide, and she stepped back instead of forward. And when the light changed again and the group moved, she was not with them. The 4 children arrived at the church at 5:37. Cornelius counted heads at the door. 4. He did not panic because he had spent 22 years in situations where panic was a luxury he could not afford, and he had consequently stopped being able to afford it even when he tried. He told Deja to keep the children inside, and he walked back out the way they had come. He retraced the route methodically, checking doorways between parked cars under the awning of the dry cleaner that had been closed for 2 years. He checked the alley beside the laundromat. He crossed to the supermarket parking lot on the adjacent block and moved down the row of vehicles the way he had moved down corridors in federal facilities when a person who did not want to be found needed to be found anyway. He found her between 2 parked SUVs near the far end of the lot. She was crouched with her knees pulled to her chest, her face wet, crying in the particular silence of a child who has been crying long enough that the sound has given out and only the motion remains. Her eyes were closed. She had not heard him coming. The parking lot smelled of cold exhaust and wet asphalt. The overhead light above the far row of cars buzzed at a frequency that seemed to sharpen the cold rather than fight it. Somewhere behind the supermarket, a delivery truck engine idled. These details entered Cornelius's awareness and were catalogued and set aside in the same motion the way he catalogued everything. The habit of a man who had learned in the field that the full picture always included the periphery. He stopped 3 feet from her. He crouched to her level. He did not reach for her. He said, "Amara, it is Pastor Neil. You are not lost anymore." She opened her eyes. She looked at him the way children look at the familiar in the middle of the unfamiliar, with a recognition so total it is almost physical, a release of something held too tight. The tension in her small body shifted. Not all at once, but the way a knot shifts when the right thread is found. He said, "We are going back to the church now. Your mother knows where you are." She stood. She was shaking slightly in the November air, the temperature having dropped since 5 o'clock in the way it drops in Georgia in late fall, faster than you expect and colder than the afternoon promised. He took off his coat, the dark green pastoral coat with the small embroidered cross over the left breast pocket. The coat he wore every weekday, and most Saturdays, the coat that the congregation knew by sight and the children in the program knew by the way it felt to stand beside it, and he draped it over her shoulders. It fell past her knees. She grabbed the lapels with both hands, pulling the wool tight around her, and the embroidered cross disappeared under her fingers. He took her hand and they began the 2-block walk back toward Mount Zion. Cornelius did not feel triumphant. He did not feel relieved in the way the word is usually meant. What he felt briefly as they moved out of the parking lot and back toward the streetlights of Maple was something quieter than relief, a private settling the specific satisfaction of a person who has gone to find something that mattered and found it. He had felt it before once in the 7th year of his service when a witness in protective custody had disappeared from a safe house in Memphis, and Cornelius had found her 14 hours later in her sister's apartment on the opposite side of the city, asleep safe, unaware of how many people had been looking for her. He had stood in the doorway of that room and felt the same thing he felt now that the most important variable in the equation had been resolved and everything else could be handled. They had covered 1 block. The corner of Maple and 9th was ahead of them, the same corner where the walk group had crossed the same corner where the light had changed. The street lights were on. The temperature was 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The evening was quiet in the way that evenings in residential neighborhoods are quiet, not empty, but present porches lit one television audible through a screen door. The smell of someone's dinner carried a half block by a wind coming south. A patrol car was parked at the corner. No lights. Then blue lights cycling. The door opened. Officer Voss was 31 years old, thick through the neck, with the particular flush in his face that belongs either to exertion or something colder than exertion. He had received a 911 call from a bystander who had seen a large man wrap his coat around a small girl in a parking lot and take her hand and walk away. The bystander had seen only that moment stripped of every frame before it and had assigned it the most alarming interpretation available to him and called it in. Voss had 3 prior excessive force complaints on his record. 2 of them involved black men. All 3 had been dismissed by the same precinct captain. He was known in the district and in the neighborhoods he patrolled for arriving at a conclusion before arriving at the scene. He stepped onto the pavement. He did not announce himself. He did not ask a question. He did not look at the child's face or the coat she was wearing or the way she was holding the man's hand. He drew his weapon. He was 12 feet away. He screamed, released the child. "Get on the ground, now!" Cornelius stopped walking. He turned, not suddenly, not with the motion of a man reacting, but with the motion of a man responding, and as he turned, he kept his body positioned so that it remained between the weapon and the child. A geometry he had arranged before the turn was complete. He kept one hand visible. He said his voice, the low, resonant baritone it always was, the voice that had talked frightened witnesses through federal proceedings and hostile subjects into surrender. "My name is Cornelius Hayward. I am the director of the Safe Harbor After-School Program at Mount Zion Baptist Church, 2 blocks north. This child is Amara, registered in our program. She separated from the walk group 20 minutes ago. I found her, and I am walking her back." Voss screamed. "I said, get on the ground." Amara heard the screaming and pressed her face into Cornelius's chest. Her hands tightened on the lapels of the dark green coat, and she made a sound that was not quite crying. Something older than crying something below it. The sound of a child understanding that the world has become dangerous in a way she does not have the vocabulary for yet. Cornelius put his free hand on the back of her head. He kept his eyes on Voss. He said, "I understand. I am complying. But this child is frightened by the raised weapon. I need you to hear me while I kneel." His voice did not rise. It did not shift in cadence. It was the same voice he had used in the program room an hour ago explaining long division to a 9-year-old who thought he hated math. Voss stepped closer, 8 feet. Cornelius sank slowly to his knees on the pavement. The cold came through his slacks, immediately 42 degrees Fahrenheit concrete, the particular cold that has no mercy, because it is not trying to be cruel. It simply is what it is. Amara came down with him, her face still against his chest, her hands still gripping the coat. He closed his arms around her completely. His posture on the ground was not submission. A person watching from any of the 3 porches visible from that corner would have seen a man kneeling, but the kneeling looked nothing like defeat. It looked like a wall. It looked like the only standing structure on a plain after everything else has been leveled. The dark green pastoral coat was wrapped around the child so completely that only her small hands and the top of her head were visible above the neckline, and those hands were gripping the lapels, the way hands grip the one thing available to grip when the world has become unsteady and the grip did not loosen. Voss watched this. He watched the kneeling man and the child in the coat and the 3 neighbors on their porches and the second officer who had not followed his instruction, and what moved across his face was not uncertainty. He was not a man who experienced uncertainty easily, but calculation. He was constructing a version of events. He was finding the edges of what had happened and deciding which ones to sharpen and which to file down. He had done this before. He had done it 3 times before, each time in a precinct captain's office, each time successfully. He did not yet understand that this time was different. He did not understand because he had not yet looked at the credential lying on the pavement, and he had not looked at the credential because looking at it would require acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that the geometry of the situation had been wrong from the first second. Inside his arms, Cornelius held a thing he recognized. He had been in positions structurally identical to this one, lower to the ground, more dangerous terrain. Higher stakes in the government's definition of those words, and what he recognized was not the cold, or the weapon, or the screaming, but the requirement. The requirement to be steady when everything around you is not. He had learned it in his first year as a deputy and refined it over 22 years, and brought it here to this program, to this room, to this neighborhood, because the children who arrived at Mount Zion at 3 o'clock every afternoon needed the same thing that a frightened federal witness needed in the middle of the night. Before a trial, someone in the room who was not going to break. His knees were on cold pavement. He did not feel the cold. He looked at Amara's face, which was turned up toward him. Now her eyes wide and tracking his with the intensity of a child finding a fixed point in a spinning room. He held that eye contact like a lifeline. He said barely above a whisper, "Breathe with me. In and out. There you go." Neighbors on the visible porches, an older woman named Gloria Tate who had lived in that house for 31 years. A man named Darnell who had come out to bring in his recycling bin, and a teenage girl who had been sitting on her front steps doing something on her phone. All three of them stopped what they were doing and looked. They would remember the coat. The dark green pastoral coat with the small embroidered cross swallowing the child inside it. Her small hands gripping the lapels, the top of her head visible above the neckline. They would remember the man's face turned slightly down toward the child, his lips moving. They would remember that his eyes were not on the gun. His eyes were on her face. Voss screamed, "Stop talking." Cornelius did not stop talking. He continued to speak to Amara in the same measured cadence, and then, without changing the cadence, he folded the words addressed to her into words addressed to Voss, the way a conductor holds two sections in the same beat. He said, "Breathe, Amara. Officer, the child's name, is Amara Okafor. Her mother is Dr. Simone Okafor, a pediatric surgeon at Caldwell Regional. In and out, baby. The guardian notification was sent at 5:22 this evening. The church is 2 blocks north on Maple. Breathe. I have identification." The contradiction of the order Voss had given, release the child and get on the ground, two instructions that could not be simultaneously performed with a 7-year-old pressed against a man's chest, was visible to everyone on the block. It had a shape. It had weight. Gloria Tate on her porch watched Officer Voss, watching the kneeling pastor and the child in the green coat, and she understood something she could not have named, but had felt before the specific shape of a confrontation that has stopped being about anything real and has become about something else entirely, something older and uglier and far less specific than the situation in front of it. A second police unit arrived. The car pulled up behind Voss's and the door opened and Officer Danielle Reyes stepped out. She was 26, new to the district, walking toward the scene with her hand near her weapon. Then she saw it. The kneeling man. The child's hands on the coat. The child's face turned up toward the man's face. The man's voice still going, still steady. A sound that belonged to a much calmer room than this one. Her hand dropped. She read the scene. She read it the way it asked to be read. She did not intervene. Not yet. But she stopped moving toward the man with intent and started moving toward the scene with observation, and those are completely different things, and Cornelius, without looking at her, felt the difference. Voss was 8 feet from Cornelius. He had not lowered the weapon. He had not moved. Cornelius said, still in the same voice, "I am going to reach slowly into my breast pocket. I am telling you before I move. I am not reaching for anything that requires your concern." Voss said, "Do not move." Cornelius moved anyway because the alternative was unacceptable, and because a man who has spent 22 years in federal service does not confuse a lawful instruction with an unlawful one, and does not comply with the second kind simply because someone is screaming it. He moved with the kind of deliberate slowness that makes the word slow seem inadequate, narrating every centimeter, his voice steady, his face calm, his eyes on Voss. He removed his phone from his breast pocket. He held it face up so that the screen was visible. The Safe Harbor app was open. Amara's entry was on screen: her name, the church address, the check-in time 3:07 p.m., and the guardian contact. He placed the phone face up on the pavement. He slid it forward toward Voss across the concrete. Voss did not look at the phone. He did not look down at all. Cornelius reached into his jacket pocket and removed his wallet. He opened it. He removed the retired federal identification card and placed it face up on the pavement beside the phone. The card was cream-colored with a seal bearing his photograph and his name, the full 22 years of his service printed on it in the plain, factual language of the federal government. It read, United States Marshal Service. It was federally recognized. It was not a relic. It was a document with legal standing, and Cornelius knew exactly what it meant, and so did every other person on that pavement who had any experience with federal law enforcement. He slid it forward to rest beside the phone. Reyes stepped forward. She looked down at the credential. Her expression changed in a way that was not dramatic, but was total. The change that happens when the last piece of a picture arrives, and the picture is not what you thought it was. She picked it up. She looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then she clicked her radio. Voss said, Reyes, stand back. She did not stand back. She spoke into the radio with the credential in her hand. From somewhere down the block, voices were audible. The church's evening volunteers had noticed Amara was not back. One had stepped outside. One had seen the squad car. 4 adults and 12 children were now gathered at the far end of the block watching. One of those adults had called Simone Okafor. Simone was between surgeries. She had changed out of one set of scrubs and not yet into the next. She was in the anteroom when her phone rang, and a volunteer said the word gun, and the rest of the sentence did not matter, because Simone had already identified her daughter's name in the middle of it, and was moving. She moved the way she moved in surgical emergencies, not running, because running is inefficient, and does not allow for the precise deployment of attention, but fast. The purposeful corridor-eating speed of someone for whom controlled urgency is a professional baseline. Someone who has been trained to arrive at the thing that is on fire and not to stop being functional when she gets there. Back on the pavement, Cornelius held Amara and counted. He was counting things that no one else on the block knew he was counting. He was counting seconds, since Reyes had called in the credential 70, 80, 90. Because he knew the response time on a federal credential check, and he knew what 90 seconds felt like, and he knew that what came back from dispatch in the next 30 seconds would either widen the door or close it. He was counting Amara's breathing, steadier now, but not steady the specific rhythm of a child who has been frightened and is holding herself together because the person holding her is holding himself together. He was counting Voss's micro-movements, the jaw tightening, the hand adjusting on the weapon, the glance at the radio and then away, because he had read 100 suspects in 100 fields, and he knew what a man looked like when he was calculating the odds of getting ahead of information that was about to arrive. The concrete under his knees had no warmth in it. The cold had moved past the discomfort stage and into the simple fact stage, the stage where it is no longer something you feel but something that simply is. Cornelius had been in colder places in worse circumstances. He counted that too, a different kind of count, the tally of things survived that recalibrates the threshold for what constitutes unbearable. Once in his 21st year of service, he had spent 6 hours prone in a field outside a warehouse in Arkansas, waiting for a federal fugitive to exit a door that opened onto the north side. 6 hours, 40 degrees Fahrenheit. He had thought during those 6 hours about whether his mother's recipe for her specific version of sweet potato pie had been written down anywhere, or whether it existed only in her hands, about the particular quality of silence in a federal courtroom. The moment a verdict is read about the way his daughter had laughed at something on television the previous Sunday morning, a laugh so unguarded and pure that he had felt it land in his chest like something physical. He had not thought about the cold. He was not thinking about it now either. He was thinking about Amara's breathing and the dispatch clock, and the sound of the radio, and whether Voss's finger was inside or outside the trigger guard, and whether Reyes was going to hold or fold. He kept talking to Amara in the voice that did not change. Darnell on his porch across the street had stopped moving entirely. He was a man of 50 who had lived in this neighborhood for 22 years, and had watched things happen on this block that he could not change, and had felt the helplessness of that watching many times. And he was feeling it now in a more concentrated form than usual, because the man on the ground was someone he recognized, had nodded to, had watched escort children up and down this very block on Tuesday and Thursday evenings for years. He took out his phone. He began recording. He would later state that he had not decided to begin recording. He had simply found himself doing it the way you do things in the presence of something that you already know will matter and cannot afford to not have documented. The teenage girl on her front steps had looked up from her phone when Voss began screaming, and had not looked back down since. She was 16. Her name was Destiny, and she was watching the kneeling pastor and the child in the green coat with the focused attention of a person who is witnessing something and understands on some wordless level that witnessing is the only thing required of her right now and that she should do it without blinking. She did not take out her phone. She simply watched. Gloria Tate on her porch watched too. She was 71 years old, and she had been watching things happen on corners in this part of Georgia for 7 decades, and what she felt watching this was not surprise. Surprise would have meant she had expected differently. What she felt was something older and more exhausted than surprise, the feeling of a woman who has seen this shape before in different rooms, with different names, and recognizes it the way you recognize a recurring dream, not with alarm, but with the specific dread of familiarity. Dispatch responded at 51 seconds after Reyes called it in. The radio produced a voice that said, "Unit 4, be advised, credential confirmed. Retired United States Marshal, 22 years federal service. No record, no flags. Repeat, no record." The sound of a room changing. Except it was a street, and the room that changed was larger than a room, and the change moved through it, the way a cold front moves not visibly but pressing against the temperature of everything it touched. Voss heard it. His color remained steady because he had not yet decided what the information meant to him strategically. He was a man who processed external facts by first calculating their threat to his position, and he was still calculating. Reyes lowered the radio. She looked at Voss. She looked at the man on the ground, and the child in the dark green coat, and the phone and the credential lying on the pavement in a line documented visible exactly where they had been placed. Voss made his mistake. He stepped forward. He bent down and reached toward the credential on the pavement, not to verify it, but to pick it up and put it in his hand, because having the object in his hand meant having control of the evidence, which was the last form of control available to him in a situation that was evacuating his authority from every direction. He reached for it. Reyes was still holding it. He held out his hand toward her. Headlights swept the corner. A car stopped at the intersection, not parked. Stopped at an angle that suggested the driver had not arrived at a destination, but had arrived at a location and intended to get out immediately. The door opened before the engine was fully off. Dr. Simone Okafor stepped out of the car. She was wearing her scrubs. Her hospital ID was clipped to the front of her top, the laminated card with her photograph and her title, and the name of the hospital visible from 10 feet in the amber of the streetlight. She had 42 minutes of surgical attending authority in that building, and the specific grounded calm of a person who has spent a decade making high-stakes decisions in irreversible windows of time, and has learned that panic is a form of inattention she cannot afford. She walked toward the scene without hesitating. Not running. Walking with the velocity of a controlled fall, each step placed with intention. Her eyes found Amara before she reached the curb. The look on her face when she saw her daughter, the coat, the hands on the lapels, the face turned into the man's chest, was a thing that would stay with everyone present for a long time afterward. It was not relief, and it was not horror. and it was not grief, though it contained all three. It was something more specific, the expression of a woman who has spent 6 months trusting a man with everything she has, and has just seen that trust confirmed in the hardest possible way, and the most wrong one. She walked past Voss. She did not look at him. She reached Reyes and said her voice, the voice of a person who has given 300 pre-surgery introductions to anxious families in corridors. "I am Dr. Simone Okafor. That is my daughter, Amara Okafor. The man holding her is Pastor Cornelius Hayward, the director of the Safe Harbor program at Mount Zion Baptist Church on this block. I received his 522 walk group notification this evening on WhatsApp. I have it on my phone." She held out her phone. The WhatsApp conversation was on screen. The message from Cornelius's number. The timestamp 5:22 p.m. Her read receipt 5:24 p.m. 2 hours before the surgery, she had been in the middle of finishing when the call came. Reyes looked at the phone. She looked at the credentials still in her own hand. She looked at Voss. Simone moved past Reyes and crouched beside Cornelius and Amara. She put her hand on Amara's back, not urgently, not with the intensity that would have frightened the child further, but with the specific pressure of a hand that Amara had felt every night of her life and recognized with the whole of her nervous system. Amara heard her mother's voice and lifted her face from the coat. She said, "Mama." Simone said, "I'm here. I have you." It was the same cadence Cornelius had been using for the last 4 minutes. The echo of it was not accidental. It was not even deliberate. It was simply what people who are keeping other people steady sound like. She looked at Cornelius. He met her eyes. The look between them was not gratitude in the preliminary sense, not the gratitude that comes before you fully understand what someone has done. It was the recognition that comes after the recognition of a woman who has watched something like this happen before, who has been on a different side of this machinery before, who knows precisely the shape of what she is looking at and what it cost the man on his knees to hold it together. It was a recognition almost like grief. It was a recognition like being called as a witness to something that should never have required a witness. 3 years earlier, Simone Okafor had been driving home from a late shift on a Tuesday when a patrol car pulled her over 2 blocks from this corner. The officer who had gotten out of that car had looked at her license and her hospital ID clipped to her coat, and had told her in a voice that was not raised and was in that way more precise than shouting that she should go back to the hospital because it was safer for people like her. She had not moved. She had looked at his face, and she had memorized his badge number, and she had filed a formal complaint the following morning with her hands completely steady, the hands of a surgeon, the hands of someone who does not flinch in conditions that require precision. The complaint had been dismissed 4 months later without investigation. She had received a single letter with a case number. She had memorized the case number. She had carried it for 3 years in the same internal pocket where you carry things that are not resolved and may never be, but that you refuse to release because releasing them feels like agreeing that they did not matter. The officer who had said those words to her was standing 8 feet away. He was holding a weapon that had been confirmed to be aimed at a retired federal officer and a 7-year-old child for the last 4 minutes and 20-some seconds, and the dispatch radio had confirmed the credential 140 seconds ago, and the weapon was still in his hand. Reyes said, her voice quiet, the voice of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided the right moment is now Kyle. Put the weapon down. Voss did not move. The seconds passed the way. Seconds pass in a sealed room, each one separate, distinct audible in a way that seconds are not usually audible. 1, 2, 3. Reyes said Kyle. 4. Voss holstered his weapon. The body cam on his chest had been recording since he stepped out of the patrol car. The timestamp embedded in every frame was the timestamp of the manufacturer's clock, unalterable, federally admissible. It showed the weapon drawn at 5:39 and 14 seconds. It showed the dispatch confirmation arriving at 5:41 and 28 seconds. It showed the weapon holstered at 5:43 and 51 seconds. 4 minutes and 37 seconds. 4 minutes and 37 seconds after the radio had confirmed in official Federal dispatch language with no record and no flags that the man on the ground was a retired United States Marshal with 22 years of service. The weapon had remained raised and aimed at him and at the 7-year-old child pressed against his chest. That number 4 minutes and 37 seconds was not an interpretation. It was not a characterization. It was an arithmetic fact generated by 2 timestamps that no one had touched and no one could change. It was already in federal documentation before Voss had fully holstered the weapon. It would be entered as Exhibit A at trial. It would be read aloud in a federal courtroom in front of a jury, a judge, and a gallery, and every person in that room would feel the length of it, because 4 minutes and 37 seconds is not a quick moment of poor judgment. It is a duration. It is a decision repeated every second for 277 seconds after the information that ended the justification for the decision had already arrived. Think about that. 4 minutes and 37 seconds on a November evening at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. A 7-year-old girl in a borrowed coat pressed against a man's chest. Her breathing finally steadied. After minutes of terror, her hands still gripping the lapels because loosening them would mean something she was not ready for. A man on his knees who had done everything right identified himself, placed his evidence on the pavement, narrated every movement, lowered his body to the ground without a struggle, and the radio had spoken. The credential had been confirmed and the weapon remained. 4 minutes and 37 seconds of a child remaining in proximity to a loaded gun that the law had at that moment no justification for keeping raised. This is the number that would define Kyle Voss. Not the draw, not the screaming, not the 3 prior complaints. This number, because the draw and the screaming and the complaints could each be argued, contextualized, contested. 4 minutes and 37 seconds after confirmation could not. It was a clock. It was a record. It was patient in the way that the truth is patient because the truth does not need to rush. It is already what it is. It simply waits to be read. The precinct supervisor arrived 12 minutes later. He had been called by Reyes, not by Voss. Lieutenant Carver was 58 years old and had been with the department for 30 years, and had long since reached the age at which he could no longer pretend not to see things clearly. He stepped out of his vehicle and stood at the edge of the scene and took in what was in front of him. He took in the credential in Reyes's hand. He took in Simone kneeling beside Cornelius and Amara. He took in Voss standing apart from the scene in the way a person stands apart from something when they have realized they are no longer part of a position of strength but have not yet accepted what that means. He took in the neighbors on their porches, one of them still recording on a phone. He took in all of it and said nothing for a moment. And the silence of a supervisor arriving at a scene and choosing to understand it before speaking is a particular kind of silence that everyone on a scene recognizes. Simone Okafor stood up from beside Amara and Cornelius. She faced the lieutenant directly. She said, 3 years ago, Officer Voss pulled me over on this same street 2 blocks from where you are standing. He told me to go back to the hospital. He said it was safer for people like me. I filed a complaint. The complaint was dismissed. The case number is CF-2021-4773. She said the case number from memory. She stated it the way a surgeon states a procedure code precisely without consultation because she had prepared for a long time for the possibility that she would need to state it somewhere that mattered. The lieutenant's expression did not change in any external way, but something behind it changed. He turned and looked at Voss. The church security camera footage was reviewed on the tablet that Marcus brought from the program. The footage showed the full sequence from the beginning. Amara at the crosswalk, the moment of separation, the group continuing without her. The 4 children returning to the church, Cornelius emerging alone, his deliberate progress through the route, the entry into the parking lot, the find the crouch, the coat going around the child's shoulders, the walk back beginning the patrol car at the corner. Every timestamp in this footage was consistent with everything Cornelius had stated from his knees on the pavement. Every timestamp was inconsistent with the assumption Voss had arrived with. Voss was placed on administrative leave at the scene. His weapon was secured by the supervisor. He stood at the edge of the curb watching this happen with the expression of a man who is realizing that the room he thought he was controlling has been rearranged around him while he was standing in it. His jaw was tight. His hands, now without the weapon, had nowhere to go and kept moving toward his belt and then stopping the ghost motion of a man whose authority has been physically removed and whose body has not yet processed the information. He had not looked at Cornelius once since the supervisor arrived. He would not look at him at any point that evening. This was noticed by everyone present. Cornelius stood up from the pavement. He stood with the particular uprightness of a man who has been on the ground and is now choosing to stand, which is different from simply getting up. He picked up his phone. He picked up the credential. He placed both in his pockets. He looked at the supervisor and said, "I am going to take these children back to the church now." He did not wait for permission. He walked toward the group at the end of the block. He put his hands on two shoulders the way he always did and turned the group gently back toward Mount Zion, and the group moved with him because groups move with Cornelius Hayward. They had moved with him for 30 years in two completely different kinds of work, and the reason was the same in both. He was the steadiest thing in the room, and everyone in the room knew it without being told. Simone walked beside him for the half block to the church with Amara between them. At the church door she stopped. She looked at Cornelius and said something she would not repeat to anyone later, and that Cornelius would not repeat either, and whatever it was the thing that needed to be said, and it was enough. Cornelius walked the children back to the church, and he counted heads twice at the door the way he always did, and he told Deja to start the dinner rotation 30 minutes early, and he sat down in the program room, and he was the same. He was exactly the same. He did not sit differently or move differently or speak differently or hold his face in a shape that invited questions. He was the steady thing in the room, and the children around him were picking up on it the way children pick up on the temperature of a room, not consciously, not articulately, but completely and immediately. Within 15 minutes, the program room sounded the way it always sounded. Within 30 minutes, 8 of the younger children had forgotten anything unusual had happened at all. That was what he had decided when he turned back toward the church with 5 children around him and the supervisor on the phone behind him. He had decided that the room would be what the room was supposed to be. He had made that decision the same way he had made decisions in the field, quickly, clearly, without drama, and without any expectation that the decision would be reviewed. The prior complaint Simone had filed, the one with the case number she had carried for 3 years, was reopened the following morning. The 2 prior excessive force complaints from Voss's record, both involving black men, both dismissed by the same precinct captain without investigation, were reopened simultaneously. Federal review was initiated under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 242. The civil rights statute that addresses the deprivation of rights under color of law. The statute requires a pattern to establish a federal case. 3 incidents, same officer, documented. The pattern had already existed. The federal review simply named it. The precinct captain who had dismissed all 3 complaints was included in the review as a separate subject. In the weeks that followed, the shape of what had happened on Maple Street reorganized itself from an incident into a record. The body cam footage from Voss's chest circulated among federal investigators with the precision of material that has been waiting for someone to examine it. The timestamp of the weapon draw was there. The timestamp of the dispatch confirmation was there. The 4 minutes and 37 seconds between those 2 timestamps was there, immovable in official federal documentation in front of everyone who needed to see it. At the federal indictment hearing, the body cam footage was entered as Exhibit A. The church security camera footage was entered as Exhibit B. The 3:07 p.m. Safe Harbor app check-in was entered as Exhibit C. The 5:22 p.m. WhatsApp notification and the 5:24 p.m. red receipt were entered as Exhibit D. Simone Okafor testified. She stated the case number from memory in the federal courtroom the same way she had stated it on the street. The jury watched her say it. They understood what it meant to carry a case number in your memory for 3 years, to keep it there. The way you keep something that has not yet been made right, that you are not certain will ever be made right, but that you refuse to let yourself forget, because forgetting feels like a second defeat. Officer Reyes testified. She had requested a transfer the night of the incident before she had submitted her written report, because she had understood from the moment she arrived on scene what had happened and what she had failed to do earlier, and she was not willing to spend another shift in the same patrol district pretending otherwise. The transfer was granted. She sat in the witness box and described what she had seen from the moment she arrived, the sequence, the credential on the pavement, the dispatch response, the 4 minutes and 37 seconds, the exact position of Voss's weapon during all 4 minutes and 37 of them. She testified with the particular plainness of someone who has decided that the only thing she has left to offer is accuracy and who is offering it completely. She did not editorialize. She did not characterize. She stated what she had observed and what the body cam had recorded, and what the credential had said, and what dispatch had confirmed, and what had happened in the 277 seconds between the confirmation and the holster. She stated it once in full without revision. It was enough. The 4 minutes and 37 seconds were presented to Voss's supervisor in open court. The supervisor sat in the witness box while the federal prosecutor asked him to confirm that the dispatch confirmation had arrived at 5:41 and 28 seconds, and that the weapon had been holstered at 5:43 and 51 seconds, and that the difference between those two times with a confirmed retired federal officer and a 7-year-old child in the frame was 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The supervisor confirmed it. The prosecutor asked him to confirm what department policy required an officer to do upon receiving a dispatch confirmation of a subject's legitimate federal identity during an active stop. The supervisor confirmed what policy required. The prosecutor asked him to characterize the 4 minutes and 37 seconds in relation to that policy. There was a silence in the courtroom that had a weight to it. Then the supervisor said what the evidence required him to say in the same room where Voss was sitting in front of Voss's own attorney and the jury and the federal judge and the gallery and the recording equipment that would make it permanent. He said it plainly. He said it without equivocation. He said it with the voice of a man who has had 30 years to practice the difference between what is true and what is comfortable, and has arrived perhaps too late at the understanding that in a room like this one, only one of those two things is available. Voss sat at the defense table, and his color, which had been steady for most of the trial, drained in the way that color drains from the faces of men who have spent a long time believing that the machinery will accommodate them, and have just discovered that it will not. His attorney put a hand on his arm. He did not appear to feel it. Voss was convicted on all 3 counts. The precinct captain was convicted separately on charges of obstruction and suppression of misconduct complaints. His trial followed Voss's by 6 weeks and ended in the same verdict by a different jury that had been given, among other evidence, 3 complaint files and the documentation of how each had been handled and what each dismissal had cost the people who filed them. Both sentences were delivered within 30 days of each other. Federal prison. No early release provision in either case that the prosecutor did not object to. The objections were sustained. Voss's attorney called character witnesses. None of them were officers from his own precinct. The precinct in its entirety did not appear for him. Not a single officer. The gallery on his side of the courtroom was notable for what was absent from it, and what was absent was the community that a man in his position is supposed to have built over a decade of public service. He had not built one. The courtroom made that visible in the way that courtrooms make things visible without commentary, without judgment, simply by showing what is present and what is not. Amara was in therapy for 6 weeks. She had nightmares in the first 2 weeks, the kind that follow encounters with sudden violence, with the specific trauma of being held during danger by someone else's calm and understanding that the calm was the only thing standing between you and something worse. She recovered. Children do when the people around them are paying attention. On her first day back at Safe Harbor, she came through the door the way she always came through the door. She found Cornelius in the room. She sat down next to him with her homework folder and opened it and said nothing. Cornelius said nothing. She did her homework. He sat beside her doing what he always did in the program room in the evenings, which was everything at once, managing the room from his chair, his eyes moving without appearing to move. At some point in the first hour, she reached across the table without looking up from her workbook and touched the sleeve of his coat, the dark green pastoral coat, the one with the embroidered cross over the left breast pocket, the one she had gripped on the pavement with 2 fingers. She did not squeeze it or hold it. She simply touched it. Then she went back to her workbook. Cornelius noted this in the same way he noted everything, without changing his face, without comment, with total attention. He understood what it was. It was a child confirming that the thing she had trusted was still there, still real, still present. It was the simplest form of courage. They did not discuss what had happened. Some things between people are established in the way a bone heals. The break is real, and the healing is real, and the resulting density is different from what existed before, stronger in the specific place where the fracture was. Marcus updated the Safe Harbor app to include an emergency alert function, one button that notified every guardian on the list simultaneously with the program's GPS address. He installed it the week after the incident and demonstrated it to Cornelius on a Thursday afternoon. Cornelius looked at the screen. He nodded. He said, "Good work." Marcus wanted to say something more. He had been wanting to say something more since the night of the incident, some acknowledgement of what had happened and what Cornelius had done, and what it had cost and what it meant. But every time he found the edge of the sentence, he could feel that Cornelius did not want it and would not receive it, and would simply nod with the same expression he used for everything and move on. So Marcus said nothing more. He put the phone back in his pocket and went back to his table. That too was a form of respect. The church security camera was replaced with a wider angle unit, higher resolution, covering a 3-block radius. Cornelius had selected the new placement himself, standing outside in the cold measuring angles with the same unhurried precision he had brought to everything for the last 30 years. If you have stayed with this story to its end, you already know what it is about. It is not about one officer or one city or one night in November. It is about what happens when a man spends 22 years learning how to protect people, and then spends another 11 years doing it in a different building for a different reason in a different coat. It is about the difference between power that takes and power that holds. It is about a 7-year-old girl who will grow up knowing that when the world became dangerous, she was not abandoned in it, and about what that knowledge does to a person over the course of a life. It is about a mother who carried a case number in her memory for 3 years, because she refused to agree that it did not matter, and who was proven right, not in the way she hoped, but in the only way that was available. Subscribe if this channel gives you something worth coming back for. Share this if someone needs to hear it. The comment section is open. 6 months after the incident, Cornelius was at the corner of Maple and 9th with a walk group. 5 children. He counted them at the church door. He counted them at the first crosswalk. He counted them at the corner store. He counted them again when they turned back toward the church. He counted them again at the church door. 5. All 5. He held the door open and they went through, and the program room received them with the warm, ordinary sound of safety children talking over each other, chairs scraping, the smell of something cooking in the kitchen. Evening light through tall windows pressing long amber rectangles against the floor. The room was full and loud and bright and exactly what it was supposed to be. Cornelius stood at the edge of it. His dark eyes moved across it, completely missing nothing, tracking everything, the particular vigilance of a man for whom attention is not an effort, but a practice. A thing he does the way he breathes without deciding to, because it has been built into him by decades of work that required it, and a decade more of work that needed it for different reasons and asked no less of him. He wore the dark green pastoral coat. The embroidered cross over the left breast pocket caught the light. A child wrapped in a man's coat on cold pavement is not a mystery. It is the oldest story. There is someone standing between harm and the helpless, asking nothing in return. Quiet dignity will always outlast loud prejudice, and the record, once it exists, does not negotiate.